Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Feddie Fight Nights, brought to you by the Federalist Society Student Division and the Federalist Society at Notre Dame Law School. My name is Olivia Rogers, and I'm the president of the Federalist Society Student Chapter at Notre Dame Law School. I'm honored to be here tonight to say a little bit about Feddie Fight Nights and to introduce our two distinguished fighters. Feddie Fight Nights is a series put on by the Federalist Society Student Division. Over the course of the semester, the Student Division and one law school chapter will co-host a virtual showcase debate that will stream to Federalist Society chapters nationwide. The Notre Dame Law School chapter is delighted to be hosting the first debate in the fall 2022 series. Now to our introductions. First, I'd like to introduce our distinguished moderator, Jennifer Braceras. Jennifer is the director of the Independent Women's Law Center. A former member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, Jennifer is an expert on Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 and has taught courses on civil rights and constitutional law. Jennifer is a graduate of Harvard Law School. After law school, she clerked for 2 federal judges and practiced labor and employment law with the Boston law firm Ropes & Gray. A longtime political columnist and editor, Jennifer's writings has appeared in a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, The Hill, and National Review Online. And now for our fighters. First up, Professor David Bernstein. David Bernstein is a professor and the executive director of the Liberty and Law Center at the Antonin Scalia Law School in Arlington, Virginia, where he's been teaching since 1995. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and the author of dozens of frequently cited scholarly articles, book chapters, think tank studies, and most recently, the book Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. Professor Bernstein teaches products liability, evidence, con law 1 and 2, and scientific and expert evidence. Professor Bernstein is a contributor to several blogs, including The Bullet Conspiracy, Instapundit, and the Times of Israel. Now for Randall Kennedy. Randall Kennedy is a professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He is also a graduate of Yale Law School and clerked for Judge J. Scalia Wright of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. Awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and the Law, Professor Kennedy writes for a wide range of scholarly and general interest publications and has published several books about discrimination and affirmative action in the law. At the end of this evening's debate, we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. You must either be logged in as a participant in the Zoom webinar in order to ask questions. Please either use the raise hand function in the Zoom to enter the queue to ask your question out loud, or submit a written question via the Q&A function down below. When we get to your question, you'll be called if you want to speak, or we'll read your question out. If you're calling in from your phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. Now we're ready to turn to the main event. Coming to you live from various locations via Zoom, the Federalist Society is proud to present Feddie Fight Nights, and I'll hand it over to our moderator, Jennifer.
Thank you, Olivia. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight for this important discussion on racial classifications with 2 of the nation's most insightful and thoughtful legal minds, neither of whom I think can themselves be easily classified politically or ideologically, and that's a good thing. Tonight's topic is, I believe, a uniquely American one. As a nation of immigrants from every country in the world and every conceivable racial and ethnic group, America is truly a multi-ethnic and multiracial society. And that too is a good thing. It is one of our country's great strengths and forms the basis of our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. But what happens when our diversity becomes not just a cause for celebration, not even just a way to label people, but a way of sorting people into a complex hierarchy of victimization? And what happens when benefits, including government contracts, jobs, and admission to college, are doled out on the basis of this racial hierarchy? While our discussion tonight isn't explicitly about affirmative action or racial preferences, it is, in fact, impossible to have a serious discussion about affirmative action without first having this conversation. A conversation about how American racial classifications developed, and how they operate in practice. We will start with Professor Bernstein, whose book Classified forms the basis of our discussion. Professor Bernstein will be followed by Professor Kennedy, after which I will ask a few questions and open it up to the audience, as Olivia noted. Professor Bernstein, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to Professor Kennedy for joining us here today. I've long been a great admirer of his work, so it's a pleasure to have this dialogue with him tonight. Racial classifications dictated by law have been as American as apple pie since the 19th century. We tend to nowadays shake our heads with disgust when we read about the absurd lengths authorities went to in classifying Americans when they were enforcing racist Jim Crow and immigration laws before the modern civil rights era. Some of you are familiar with the concepts of quadroons or octoroons and so forth. And we do tend to be, feel revulsion at these things. But ironically, government mandated racial classification is more common than ever. Applying for a job or a mortgage, receiving a COVID vaccine, of course, applying to college or law school, and many other common activities require checking racial and ethnic boxes. So one thing, I guess the main idea behind my book is I think many of us have a notion that modern classification norms arose kind of spontaneously, and we're not aware that to a large extent they're the product of an obscure government rule known as Statistical Directive Number 15, which is perhaps the most significant federal regulation you almost certainly have never heard of. I had never heard of it before I started doing this research. The Federal Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, enacted this rule in 1977 because government agencies in the post-civil rights era were receiving all sorts of data about American ethnic and racial groups, but they were receiving it from different agencies that used different definitions that were inconsistent with each other. So for example, the classification that we now know as Hispanic, I counted at least 8 different ways government agencies defined this particular group. And so agencies found themselves comparing apples to oranges when they're trying to compare data across agencies. Now, when OMB created this directive, they warned explicitly in the Federal Register that the classifications were for statistical convenience only and were not scientific nor anthropological in nature, and they were not to be used to determine eligibility for government programs. Because that was their intent, they didn't really attract a lot of public attention, very little public debate, almost no public controversy, and they were seen as not especially consequential. But in practice, they wound up spreading by government dictate to all aspects of American life. So my book goes into the history of these classifications, how they're defined, how they're enforced when someone's racial status becomes a legal issue, and how they wound up becoming such an important part of American society. But rather than summarizing the book, I thought I'd go through some bullet points of interesting things in the book that could help spark some discussion with Professor Kennedy, or that I thought those of you who are listening might find especially interesting. One that came up immediately is why we classify only by race or by Hispanic ethnicity, but not by religion, national origin, or other protected classes under the 14th Amendment and civil rights laws. Classifications really started in the modern times, in the 1950s, when President Eisenhower issued an executive order requiring federal contractors to not discriminate based on employment, and to monitor that, they had to classify people. And at the time, there was significant discrimination against Jews, against Catholics, against certain American European ethnic groups like Italians and Poles. So why only in the end did the classifications become racial? There was sort of an ideological or pragmatic reason behind it, in terms of that people thought, well, race is really the true dividing line in American society. Other groups are discriminated against, but not the way racial groups are. But there was also, interestingly enough, a truly pragmatic reason behind it, which is that at the time, employers generally weren't supposed to ask employees about their race or religion. It was considered at best impolite, and in many states it was illegal. So the only way you could document your compliance with civil rights policies was to count up people who were visibly members of minority groups. And while you couldn't necessarily tell who was Polish or who was Italian or who was Catholic, you could tell, at least to a large extent, who quote unquote looked Black or looked Asian or looked Mexican or whatnot. Second point, Cuban Americans were almost always considered generically white through the early 1970s, and most self-identified as such. But when affirmative action policies were starting and a new Spanish origin classification was being invented, Richard Nixon insisted that include Cuban Americans for the very sort of arbitrary but not unexpected reason that he said, well, they vote Republican. Why should we give Mexicans and Puerto Ricans affirmative action benefits when they vote for Democrats, but the one group that's loyal to us should not be included? Third point, Directive 15 classifications were beyond what Nixon did when they actually got a committee together to create these classifications. They were invented in the most haphazard way you could possibly imagine. We actually have very little documentation of what happened behind the scenes, but thanks to an interview with one individual, we know what happened with regard to the Hispanic classification. Essentially, 3 volunteers were requested, 1 Cuban American, 1 Puerto Rican American, and 1 Mexican American from the bureaucracy. No one with any special expertise, but just whoever wanted to volunteer. They were put in a room, a conference room essentially, for a few months and said, hey, come up with whatever classification we're going to use as definition. And they didn't agree, but eventually one of the participants really insisted that it should go back to being Spanish. Spanish, and eventually the definition was Spanish cultural origin, and between Latino, Hispano, Spanish surname, and so forth, they eventually decided on Hispanic, which wasn't a new word, wasn't a neologism, but in the past, Hispanic had really referred to like literature, like Cervantes was Hispanic literature, but now it was going to be used to refer to people, which was kind of a new thing. No one in 1970 pretty much would have called themselves Hispanic in the United States or anywhere else for that matter. Another interesting thing, in the 1970s, South Asian Americans were classified as white before Directive 15. And when Directive 15 was drafted, it listed people from the Indian subcontinent as also being in the white category. But there was a new group, a new organization formed of Indian Americans. There weren't that many in the country at the time. And they lobbied to change. They wanted to be in the Asian American category. No one else really cared very much. There wasn't really any contrary lobbying. So they were just sort of arbitrarily moved from the white category to the Asian American category. They could be just as easily been classified as white. Number 5, some of those who were involved in Directive 15 objected to there being a white classification. They noted that it would encompass everyone from people of Icelandic descent to people of Yemeni descent, and thus include some very dark-skinned individuals, as well as ethnic groups that traditionally face discrimination regionally, like the Portuguese in New England. But they lost on that, and we, of course, do have a white classification that encompasses everyone from Iceland to Armenia to Morocco. Another point, the classifications turned out to be mutually inconsistent in how they were conceived. Again, very haphazard. American Indian is defined by cultural affinity, Black by race. Black African American is defined as someone descended from one of the Black races of Africa. Asian is defined by geography, and Hispanic is defined basically by culture or language. Another point, American Indian groups have been very protective of their turf, interestingly. So if you're a Latino, but you are 100% of indigenous origin, and even if you've never spoken a word of Spanish in your life, you live in a relatively isolated rural area where everyone still speaks an indigenous language, you're not classified as Native American. Because American Indian groups did not want to share the resources of the Bureau of Indian Affairs with them. And they also ensured that Native Hawaiians are excluded from the Native American Alaska Native classification. Native Hawaiians wanted to get out of the AAPI category because they faced discrimination in California in university admissions. So they said, we don't want to be classified with the Chinese and so forth. We'd like to be classified with American Indians. And they instead eventually created a new Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander category, which, by the way, another interesting point, does not include the Philippines, even though those are literally Pacific Islander islands, and Filipinos are anthropologically more or closely related to other Polynesians than they are to East Asians. One of the more original parts of my book, I think, is that I identify a dozen or so cases at both the administrative level and at the judicial level, almost none of which have been discussed anywhere else in the academic literature, that involves challenges to people's self-identified race. We normally think that race is purely self-identified, but that's not always the case. And this usually arises when there's a question of whether a business owner qualifies for affirmative action preferences in government contracting. And kind of disturbing to me when I read these cases, that a lot of these cases bear a striking resemblance to the so-called race trials of the pre-civil rights era that Professor Ariella Gross of USC has written about. Another point, many groups don't fit to any of the categories. If you're an Australian Aborigine, which classification are you? You're not white because you're not of European and so forth descent, but you're also not Black because you're not descended from one of the Black races of Africa. When I've talked about the book with people, I think the most common error that people make is that people think that Arab Americans are classified as something other than white, but in fact they are classified by the US government as white, which is how they were classified also under the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. And this leads to another related point, which is that given the haphazard way the Directive 15 classifications were made, perhaps not surprisingly, the classifications wound up almost exactly matching racist classifications of the pre-civil rights era. So Asian, by the Supreme Court in the 1920s, was cut off at the western border of Pakistan, cut off today at the western border of Pakistan. As I noted, Directive 15 classifications for American Indians are based on cultural affiliation, but there are many statutes that define American Indians in all sorts of ways, including tribal membership, blood quantum. The second most shocking thing I discovered in my research is that the Bureau of Indian Affairs will issue you a certificate of Indian blood quantum if you're a 1/4 American Indian or more. And my favorite, you could be an Indian if you are anyone the Secretary of the Interior deems to be an Indian. So Secretary of the Interior could just say you're an Indian and then you are, at least under some laws. A majority of members of the Asian American classification, meanwhile, reject that identity, even as a secondary identity. By contrast, while most Hispanics prefer other identities, they do accept Hispanic Latino as a secondary identity, but Latinx is another story. Conservatives have long been skeptical of racial classification by the government, as they tend to be skeptical of government initiatives in general, but the left increasingly has its own concerns. People on the left increasingly speak of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color instead of simply people of color, and anti-Blackness instead of racism, because they want to emphasize the special restrictions and violence and so forth that African Americans have faced that other groups that primarily composed of post-1965 immigrants have not. There's also increasing discussion regarding whether it makes sense to have descendants of slaves in the same category as African and Caribbean immigrants and their children, whether Hispanics of European descent should be classified as members of a minority or as generically white like other European descended Americans, whether South and East Asian Americans belong in the same classification, and whether Middle Eastern Americans should have their own classification. So there's actually some tumult on the left about classifications as well as on the right. Perhaps the most shocking material in the book, second most shocking thing was a certificate of Indian blood quantum. The most shocking thing was that Congress in the 1990s passed a law directing the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration to require the companies they regulate to recruit subjects from minority groups and report the data broken down by groups. Now, surely you would think the NIH and FDA, they're scientific agencies, they would gather geneticists, sociologists, anthropologists, and other experts together to figure out what groupings would actually make sense for scientific purposes and also to ensure public faith in the research. But you would think wrong. I suppose that they didn't want the political backlash that would come from trying to figure out what groups they should actually use, so they just defaulted to the Directive 15 classifications over the strong objections of almost every actual scientist who commented on the proposal. I remember when the rules were promulgated, OMB specifically warned these are not scientific, they're not meant to be anthropological, they're only for statistical purposes. And the result of using these in scientific research by government dictate has been what I think of as a really pernicious racial essentialism in scientific research that has also spread to medical practice that not only doesn't have a scientific grounding, it's really essentially junk science. And besides the stereotypes and the lack of scientific validity of a lot of what the companies are doing, given opportunity costs and so forth, companies have been inhibited from making real advances in medical technology by using actual genetic research, which is relatively cheap now, instead of classifications made for other purposes that aren't even really crude proxies for genetics. finally, to go to the theme of the debate, I call at the end of the book for the separation of race and state. And let me say, I don't think that this can be a complete separation the way they have in France, where they refuse to classify people at all except as French, because if we are going to continue to enforce some of our civil rights laws, like the Voting Rights Act, it requires some idea of like who's voting and who isn't. How would you know if some town in Texas or California is preventing, say, Mexican Americans from voting if you don't know who's voting? But we can certainly move more in the direction of the separation of race and state. I would start by abolishing the unscientific mandated use of Directive 15 classifications in medical research. And while I don't take a position on affirmative action per se, I think we could replace affirmative action based on race with certain non-racial criteria trying to achieve the same ends. Of course, you could go beyond affirmative action to just helping people out based on socioeconomic status. But if you are looking more narrowly at historical discrimination, if redress for past wrongs is the goal, one could, for example, use being a descendant of slaves or living on an Indian reservation as sort of quasi-proxies for race, but they're not coextensive with race. Not all members of American Indian tribes, someone who's like 128th Cherokee, but is a member of a tribe would count. You actually have to really be someone who is still suffering from the effects of good government putting your people on reservations. Indeed, to some extent, even strong proponents of affirmative action might want to move in this direction. Government contracting is the most prominent place that we use these classifications. And in government contracting, every member of every minority group gets equal benefit from affirmative action. And given the rates of immigration and intermarriage, the vast majority of Americans will soon be eligible by having one Black or Hispanic or Asian ancestor, and soon the classification, will be meaningless if everyone's getting affirmative action. I would argue that the current classifications are both over-inclusive and even more so wildly under-inclusive. If you want ethnic diversity, like in the University of Texas versus Fisher case, if University of Texas was admitting the 2000th Mexican-American matriculant, that would be considered adding more diversity, even if that was at the expense of the first Hmong or Malaysian or some other Asian ethnic group that isn't doing so well socioeconomically because they're Asian and so somehow overrepresented, even though it's a really crude way of looking at people from a part of the world that constitutes 65% of the world's population and is incredibly internally diverse. Finally, I think we do have an internal struggle in the United States. We want to maintain some sort of official racial classifications as a necessary prerequisite for addressing harm from racism. And of course, classifications themselves were invented for racist purposes back in the pre-civil rights times. But on the other hand, there's a strong urge to eliminate them as unconstitutional, anti-liberal on the other. But the one point, and I think that tension is going to continue to exist, but the one point I would like to make is I think a lot of people who sort of like the racial classifications we have, the reason they do so is that they think that racism is sufficiently entrenched in American society and the relevant classifications are sufficiently well-grounded in how Americans think about themselves that they're never going to go away. And the only way to achieve racial justice essentially is to divide people by these categories and make sure each group is getting what one might see as their fair share of resources. I think that this is too pessimistic. I think there's been a lot of progress made since the 50s on race, but I think even more so we could look at other conflicts in American history that have gone away that would seem more intractable perhaps than race at least seems today. So imagine it's 1960 and the question is whether Protestant Americans will vote for a Catholic for president. And it turns out a lot of Protestants would not. A lot of Protestants who voted for Stevenson in 56 switched and voted for Nixon in 1960. Kennedy won anyway, but only because Catholics felt themselves sufficiently put upon and they overwhelmingly voted for Kennedy. So a lot of Catholics who had voted for Eisenhower switched to the Democrats in 1960. It would have been unimaginable in 1960 that in 2022, we'd have a Catholic president, a Catholic Speaker of the House, 6 Catholic Supreme Court justices, complemented by another Jewish justice and a Jewish Senate Majority Leader. And not only will we have this, but it wouldn't really be controversial at all. So I do think that things change, things are changing, and I'm hoping that in the future, we look back on racial conflict similarly as a vestige of a less sophisticated and tolerant past. The way, if I told my kids about the Catholic Protestant thing, they would not have any idea what I'm talking about. It'd be so obscure to them. How the US government handles racial classification will play a major role in whether we reach this outcome. Law play a significant role in establishing racial division in the US, and law or its absence can play a significant role in either maintaining or abolishing, or at least severely mitigating those divisions. Thanks.
Sorry, I was on mute. Professor Kennedy, your commentary.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this forum. And Professor Bernstein, thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to offer my congratulations on your book. It's a very thoughtful book, very instructive book. And regardless of our designation as being involved in a fight, I'm going to have to disappoint people. There really is. I don't have a big fight with you. I agree with much of what you say, and I certainly agree with the sentiment, much of the sentiment behind your remarks, especially the way you ended your remarks. I thought that, yeah, it really is striking if we think about religion and how over the past half century, religious differences that were once so deep and so volatile do not seem now to have that volatility. And in a moment that is so bad in many respects, culturally and politically, it's nice to have the sort of fillip that you provided at the end of your remarks. Now, I agree with much of what you say, but I do have some questions, and I want to push you on a couple of matters. So first, in your book, it seems to me, very effectively debunk some of the boundaries that the government has created around groups. So, for instance, you talk about the Asian Americans, and you talk about what an expansive category that is, and you suggest that it would be better to have different boundaries. And there are other places where you make that point. And I think it's a strong point, but here's a question for you. Would less expansive and more and sharper edged categories really get at would that reform get rid of the problems that you mentioned? I suspect that they would get rid of some of the problems, but if you rejiggered the boundaries, it seems to me that would give rise to new problems on the edges. I mean, what we're talking about with respect to categories is rules, boundaries. Well, whenever you have rules, whenever you have boundaries, you're going to have problems on the edges. And I would suspect that if someone read your book, let's imagine, a powerful political figure read your book and prevailed on various bureaucracies to effectuate the reforms that you're pushing, things would be better. No question, things would be better. But I think you would still be able to write, at least half of your book about difficulties on the edges. I mean, this is a country with 300 million people, actually more than 300 million. As Ms. Braceras pointed out at the very beginning, this nation is talk about diversity, it's, we've got we've got all sorts of groups in the United States, all sorts of mixing and matching. And there's always going to be, it seems to, I would think it's not going to be clear. There's always going to be an appreciable amount of messiness. Second, one of the things that you do, which I think is a real compliment to you as a scholar, is you point out, you make certain concessions. You point out things that really do pose a difficulty for where you want to go. I mean, you're not afraid to say, I would love to push in this direction, but there are some impediments to the destination. There are some impediments to the program I would like to push. So page 170 of your book, I'm just going to read from the first full paragraph on the page. Government endorsed and imposed racial and ethnic categories encourage people to organize themselves politically by those categories. And you point out in the remainder of your, in your book, that there's a lot of mischief that arises when people are prompted to organize themselves ethnically, racially. And I agree with you on that. But then you get to this next sentence and you say this. When you say this, you mean people organizing themselves politically by these categories. This can help disfavored minority groups find a political voice to express valid concerns. Yes, you are right. And you concede that, it makes sense for people to organize in this way. And you also concede that people have valid concerns, and that it would, and that in pushing their valid concerns, they try to organize themselves in a way that will get them benefits, given the way our government operates. That's an important concession, it seems to me. That's not people being stupid. That's not people being silly. That's not people just, doing something arbitrarily. No, that's people being thoughtful, understanding where they are, and using, what's at hand to push for their group concerns which you admit in many instances are, quite valid. On the next page, you make another, it seems to me, very important concession. You talk about France, and you say, well, in France, the government doesn't collect racial information. We do things differently. Now, I would have liked to have heard more about France. My own understanding, it's not like France doesn't have racial problems. France, from what I've read, does have racial problems. So, one question it would seem to me to ask is, before we think about embracing, the French policy, how is that policy actually working out on the ground over there? But apart from that, you say there would be an important downside to totally failing to officially distinguish among racial and ethnic groups in the United States. Without such classifications, it would be much more difficult for the government to detect and try to redress discrimination. You're right. You're right. And that poses a real problem for the project of, separating race and the state. Now, in your book, you have you put the separation of race and state, and then you have a question mark. But I think reading between the lines, and in fact, in your opening presentation, I think you, and I think, many people, many readers who would identify with your, political sensibility would like to separate race and state. And I guess I'm wondering, can that be done given what you just said? That is to say, your concession that an important downside to totally, to getting rid of these classifications would be really to undermine, quite dramatically, the anti-discrimination regime that we have in the United States. Finally, this is my final comment. You say that, I'm quoting you, while highly imperfect, the standard racial and ethnic categories are generally good enough for their original intended main purpose, monitoring discrimination by the government contractors, mortgage lenders, educational institutions, employers, and so on against minority groups that have been subject to the most severe and pervasive discrimination. It seems to me that what you're saying is, well, yeah, there are problems, but, for the most part, we have found a way of getting through those problems. It's not pretty. It's not. It's messy. It's it's a jumble. But you suggest at the end that, given all of that, the regime we have, arguably, unless somebody can come along with a clearly better alternative, it seems to me at the end of the day, after all of your commentary, at the end of the day, it seems to me that you actually pull back from any dramatic, any sort of radical case for reforming racial classification in America. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion going forward.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. Professor Bernstein, your rebuttal.
Sure. Lesser rebuttal than commentary, I guess, on these issues. I agree that there are definitely, you're always going to, no matter what system you have, unless you go to the French system, you're going to have boundary issues. And to some extent, the boundary issues currently are getting worse because even the populations within the groups that we classify are getting more diverse. So I was actually surprised. I'm sort of embarrassed to acknowledge this, but I had no idea that 10% of the African-American population was born abroad. I would have guessed somewhere between 2 and 5%. And if you add children and grandchildren, so 30 years ago, there were a lot fewer. So it's a lot easier to figure out who we're talking about. The Latino or Hispanic population, I think that classification was less problematic a while ago because despite having Cuban Americans and Puerto Rican Americans, Mexican Americans were still 80% of the population. So you could always just read Hispanic national statistics as just being Mexican Americans. That percentage is declining, and it's especially declining regionally. So what I like to point out, like I came across a newspaper article about how Hispanics in Florida are doing educationally. And of course, the reason you use Hispanics is that's the data the government makes everyone gather. But then if you look at the Hispanic population in Florida, you have several different groups of Cuban Americans, those who came before Castro, those who came when Castro came to power, those who came in 1980 from the Mariel boat lift. You have hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans who've immigrated there in the last decade or two, especially after the last big hurricane. We'll probably get more now after this new hurricane. You have a large group of Mexican farm workers who work in agriculture in Central Florida. You have Venezuelans. You have Argentines and Brazilians who are trying to buy property in Florida to keep the government from confiscating what they have. But then even then they have internal divisions between that, the more upper middle class people like that, and people who find their way here and overstay their visas or otherwise come here illegally, and they're at odds. So when you just average all those groups together, you're getting nonsense. You're not really getting useful data. And somehow this is, I mean, the government doesn't force researchers to use this data, but in a sense, this is, people have limited resources, they act on what they have. So this is sort of a negative effect of the government. Government gives you this nice big data sets, that's what you use in your research. And I think it's really in some ways impoverished social science. Also, I hadn't really thought about this before, but one thing, I mean, I actually did come to the conclusion, I would have liked to have said the French solution is the best, because that would be more in keeping with my libertarian instincts, not to have the government do stuff that it doesn't have to do. But I do think it would make it, even in France, it makes it difficult to see what's going on, to see why North Africans are having whatever issues they're having, or when there was a big rise in anti-Semitic attacks in France, the initial reaction was, oh well, they're all just Frenchmen, so there's no real problem. But it does occur to me, interestingly enough, when the FBI gathers data on hate crimes, they do what more government agencies should do, and they don't just say, oh, we'll only look at hate crimes against the groups that are actually officially classified by the government. They look at anti-gay hate crimes, anti-Jewish hate crimes, anti-Muslim hate crimes, and we get better, more finely grained data about groups that in that particular context really need protection, but wouldn't normally be classified as minorities. So and then there's the other point that I made, but I'll reiterate, at least with regard to affirmative action in government contracting, it's already the case that if you add up just people who self-identify on the census as African-American, Hispanic, all the minority groups, it's almost 50% of the population. But then there are a lot of people who don't so identify, but may have, be able to legitimately claim that identity by having a great grandparent or a grandparent, and those numbers are just going to grow. So there is, at least in some contexts, there's the issue that you really have to create some kind of new boundary, because if not, I mean, maybe if you're against affirmative action, you think, well, this is good. If everyone's getting it, then no one's getting it. But if you have the policy out there already, it should make a certain amount of sense. So that's all a long way of saying that you're right. I did not come to the conclusion that it would be really easy and costless to just abolish racial classification. I do think that, these classifications were created for the purpose primarily of keeping track of particular groups and their socioeconomic progress, but also mostly to be able to monitor discrimination. They're crude even for that purpose. But the fact is that, even if you're someone who's 100% European descended Latino or Spanish American, if your last name is Hernandez and someone hates Mexicans and you're in California and they see your resume says Hernandez, they're probably not going to look that closely at your resume regardless. So there's something to be said, or if, someone, even if we could distinguish between how immigrants from Nigeria and American descendants of slaves are doing in the United States, the racist who is running an educational institution, doesn't want to admit Black people, isn't going to make that distinction. So for the most part, those work reasonably well, and not surprisingly, because that's what it was intended to. But I think we need to have a further discussion about whether the classifications, when they're used for other purposes, be it for government contracting or in medicine and research or in other situations, have outlived their usefulness, if they ever really were that useful. The one other point I wanted to make is that I really focus the book on, it's not a bromide against people identifying with whatever culture or ethnic group or anything else they want to identify with, or for that matter, even organizing on that basis. It's really talking about how the government has helped create and maybe distort the way people do that. And the one thing I found most disturbing about how the argument is being made is that towards the end of my research, I probably would have made a bigger deal of it if the book hadn't been basically done. I came across this whole literature on white racial consciousness. Mm-hmm. And you think if you Google white racial consciousness, you'd find a lot of David Duke and white nationalists and so forth talking about how the white people need to rise up and organize themselves. Instead, it was primarily left-wing sociologists and anthropologists and and historians and so forth, not so much law professors, who are talking about how we need to encourage white people to have more racial consciousness, to recognize their whiteness. And once they recognize their whiteness, then they will realize their white privilege. And once they realize their white privilege, they will become anti-racist allies. Now, my prejudice on this would be that is completely insane. That if you look at the broad scope of human history, the idea that people organize themselves as any kind of collective and then use that self-identity to help some other group that they're not part of, it would be a rather the exception at best. But it turns out there's actually social science research on this. And not surprisingly, people who more identify themselves, the more they identify themselves as my primary identity is as a white person, as opposed to, religious identity, cultural identity, I'm a sports fan, whatever your identity might be, not surprisingly, they turn out to be more racist and they vote for more racist policies, more racist politicians. And I would be thrilled if the only effect of this book was to make people who think that encouraging white racial consciousness is a good idea, to make them think twice, at least about the costs of that notion, that maybe this won't lead to everybody being racist, anti-racist activists, but may actually exacerbate racial tension and lead to more racist politicians on the white nationalist side getting elected and so forth. I think that itself would be a great victory if I could get through to that side.
Yeah. On the question of, your book, again, I really do applaud your book. And it does something, very important, which is ask people to ask questions and to think. So, if for instance, well, why do you, when you're asking me for my race, there might be a good reason for that, but, could you please explain it to me? It shouldn't be the case that something is just there and done and we're mindless about it. I think since we're talking about something, an important force in social affairs, race, racial classification, one of the things it seems to me that's, in your book is, well, let's simply be more thoughtful about this. Why? I want a marriage certificate. You want to know, my race. Well, maybe, but can you first of all explain to me why you want to know it? And it seems to me at every point, we should be pressing authorities to tell us why. It doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily reject, because, there might be a good reason, but, well, what is the reason? Now, I thought that in your book, I thought that the strongest, the chapter that grabbed me the most was your chapter about medicine and the way in which medical research has been affected by, sort of dictates from non-scientists. And you say, listen, let's really be careful. If we're talking about science, let's let scientists and let's let scientific principles, let's let scientific evidence govern. Let's not be doctrinaire. I thought that was a very important point. I have two questions for you, though, I want to put on the table. One is, I was a bit surprised, you expressed some degree of support for a relatively new classification, a classification that you describe as not being a racial category, quote, as such. And the classification I have in mind is ADOS, A-D-O-S. what is it? American descendants of slaves. And you express some liking actually for that category and suggest that it might prove to be a useful category. I must say, Professor Bernstein, that category, I mean, it's come up. The people who have sort of coined that phrase and like that phrase and are pushing this idea of the African descendants of slaves tend to be reparationists. And their argument seems to be that reparation should go to the African descendants of slaves, not just to anybody who in common American parlance is referred to as Black. I mean, because they say, what about the what about new immigrants from Africa, Jamaica or someplace, people whose forebears did not suffer under slavery. I'm resistant to it, though. I'm resistant to ADOS, and one reason, and here's a question for you. I mean, I call myself Black. I'm a Black American. I'm from the Deep South. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina, born in 1954. It is probably the case. It's the overwhelming likelihood is that my forebears were enslaved. That's likely the story. If you were a betting person, you could, you probably would win a bet by saying that my forebears were enslaved. But here's the but. There were Black slaveholders in South Carolina. Now, under, if you had a scheme that, or, a regime, what would we do about a person like me? Would I have to, I don't know, engage in, genealogical research? The whole move towards embracing ADOS and, what's going to happen within Black circles if you have a group that is divided from other people that think of themselves as Black. My people were descendants of slaves, your people weren't. I don't know. It makes it. I find that very troubling. Second, it was really interesting to read in your book about these cases involving, basically, controversies over race. Person A says, well, I'm Hispanic. No, you're not. Well, how do we tell? Or, Black person, or, a person who calls himself or herself Black. Somebody says, well, no, you're not. Well, what do we do? Do we do a complexion test? Do we do a hair test? Do we do a lip test? Do we do a nose test? Like in the, there is such tests were done. There was a lot of litigation over the course of American history over racial identification. One thing that strikes me is actually, I'm surprised by how rare such controversies have been. I know that at the outset of the affirmative action regime, especially with respect to higher education, if you go back to some of the early articles about affirmative action, one of the arguments against was the claim that, well, you'll have a whole lot of fraud. You'll have a whole lot of people saying that they're Black, and actually they're saying this in bad faith. They don't think of themselves as Black. And this issue was really, viewed as a major issue. Well, 30, 40, 50 years later, it seems, looking back, I'm surprised by not by how much, but how little controversy there has been in terms of individuals making claims that other people, controverted, other people challenged. In any event, what do you think about those issues, Professor Bernstein?
Yeah, so as far as ADOS goes, I'm not, I'd say, a reparationist as such, but in the context of affirmative action, I do, if you're looking for class, my belief, having been in the academy for many years, is that despite the requirement of diversity as a rationale, the primary motivating factor is the sense that African Americans have gotten a very raw deal in a whole variety of ways. We wanted to ensure that there's enough of them, whatever enough means, that they're represented. And even though a lot of affirmative action now involves Latinos, whenever you have a debate about it, it always gets back to the African American issue. And the question is, well, what are you trying to accomplish here? And I think there's reason for debate about, to what extent someone like Barack Obama or Vice President Harris, neither of whom are descendants of American slaves, but their success is in general success for the African American community, and therefore you are helping Black people in general. But the advantages that I saw of ADOS, and you pointed out the disadvantages, and they're there as well, is that it's more likely to pass 14th Amendment scrutiny to the extent the court starts questioning racial preferences, because you at least can conceive it as a non-racial category because it doesn't include all Black people. The Supreme Court may not buy that, but they've bought that in the context of Native Americans, where they say tribal membership, even though it's correlated with race, is not it's a political classification. So there's that, and there's also the reality that, there's been controversy at your own college that it was the New York Times almost 20 years ago, actually, that turns out that most, at least at the time, most students who identify as African-American were the children, either immigrants themselves or the children or grandchildren of recent immigrants, or from biracial families. And there was a group of African-American students who said, those of us, we call ourselves the descendants because we're the small group of people who actually are the kind of people we think affirmative action was originally meant to help. I take your concerns about the classification though seriously, and how it might be divisive and how it might not necessarily serve the ends. But I do think that it's the kind of, going back to what you said earlier about how we want to ask, well, why are we asking about your race to begin with? If it's really because there's a particular group of people, but there are other ways of doing it too. You could just, for example, say, we know there are certain very segregated zip codes in the US, and the people in those zip codes have high rates of all sorts of negative socioeconomic indicators. Of course, not all of those are African-American, but they are disproportionately so. And if you looked at that, you would accomplish a lot of those same ends. I mean, there's a lot of other ways of doing it. What I was frankly somewhat fascinated by was when I started writing the book in about 2018, 2019, or at least I started writing the article that became the book. I thought, wow, everyone on the left is just going to hate this, because even though the book really isn't about affirmative action, they're going to associate any criticism of the current classification scheme with criticism of affirmative action. But then it turns out that there's been all this just very recent tumult on the left about things like, well, what about white Cubans? Are they really Hispanic? What about African immigrants? Should they really be in the same classification as other African Americans? So I suppose I was specific, I especially want to mention that because it helps make the book a little ecumenical, if nothing else. Now I have, what was the second thing? I'm sorry.
I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. I didn't have a pen in front of me. So
no, that's okay.
So let me jump in and, if I may, and ask a few questions.
Mm-hmm.
You talk a lot in the book about sort of the absurdity of both the Asian American category and the Hispanic category. And I want to drill down on the Hispanic category a little bit. You may or may not know that Puerto Rico was the only part of the United States that didn't have to answer racial questions on the census until very recently. And in fact, 2010 was the first time that Puerto Ricans answered a racial question on the census, because prior to that, I guess the thinking was they're all Hispanic, they're all Puerto Rican. So they've participated twice in 2010 and in 2020. In 2010, 80% of people living in Puerto Rico identified as white. By 2020, that number had dropped to 17%. Now, part of that has to do with modifications to the census itself and the ability to check more than one racial category. But a large part of it also has to do with activist groups on the island, including the ACLU and others, trying to convince Puerto Ricans that they would be better off if they identify as more minority.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering what you make of that in terms of just this whole effort by different special interest groups to get more and more people to classify themselves or identify themselves in ways that they might not have organically seen themselves to achieve political ends.
I was not aware of that about Puerto Rico. I did come across in my research the fact that Puerto Ricans have traditionally, overwhelmingly classified themselves as white, and the people who write about this, who tend to be more on the activist end of the academy, blame this on, internalized racism or whatever, say, oh, to Americans, they would not be considered white. But, I think what that all neglects is that every society has its own sort of classification scheme and internal ways of seeing other people, and it is in fact all socially constructed. So it's one of the and also, for example, related to the Hispanic classification, if you are a wealthy, fair-skinned, European descended Caucasian living in somewhere like Mexico, you are considered white in Mexico, and to the mixed race or indigenous activists, you're sort of the oppressor, and you sort of represent the Spanish colonialists who came and conquered your country. You moved to the United States, and now you're Hispanic, a member of a minority group, and you could argue back and forth whether that makes sense or not, but it just goes to show how different societies' classification schemes could be. The example you gave me does bring up the case of Arab Americans, who there was some controversy 100 years ago as to whether they should be classified as Asian or white or something else, and they were eventually classified as white, and it wasn't really even a controversy until relatively recently. A group of Muslim, it used to be we had mostly Christian Arabs in the United States. We've had a larger Muslim immigration, and between they felt more like outsiders. They were more politically activist, especially on the left. And they, along with some Iranian American groups, have been trying to encourage the establishment of a new Middle Eastern North African classification since the 1980s. And they almost got it under the Obama administration, and Trump killed it. Biden administration is bringing it back. But one thing that's been a barrier to them is that most Iranians and Arab Americans aren't really interested in being classified as a member of a separate racial group. They don't actually think of themselves that way, because there is no such group if you're in the Middle East.
I thought that was another interesting thing in your book, as you talked about how a lot of ethnic groups, when they first came to this country, had to they didn't want to be classified as a race necessarily. And yet, so you gave the example of Jews, and yet Ashkenazi DNA is readily identifiable, right? So in some ways, being an Ashkenazi Jew is more of a race than, say, Hispanic.
Right.
I mean, you can literally, like, I had my 23andMe done. My mother's Jewish, my father's Puerto Rican. It came back 45% Ashkenazi. Like, you can identify that much more than you can identify the Hispanic side, which has Iberian Peninsula, Native, West African, all these, Italian, all these things thrown in.
Right. That's one of the things that drives me crazy about the medical chapter that Professor Kennedy referred to, is that if you're looking at it from a genetic point of view, there are a lot of groups within the classifications that are more genetically distinct than the classifications themselves. So if you're really wanting to look for genetic anomalies and how people react to medications, you would look at Ashkenazi Jews, you look at Icelanders, Hungarians. There are a lot of populations that have unique genetic markers due to isolation and endogamy. On the other hand, if you look at Hispanics, not a race at all, not you could be from anywhere, and Asian, you could be anywhere from Indians are Caucasian, and Filipinos are related to Polynesians. They have nothing anthropologically in common. Now the argument then comes up, well, but we want people to have faith in that their group is represented in the studies. And I always say, well, it's circular. Ashkenazi Jews don't sit around worrying that the Pfizer DNA COVID vaccine wasn't tested specifically on Ashkenazi Jews, though we probably have a lot more reason to worry about it if there is any reason. I don't think there's any reason the mRNA would work differently than anybody, but if there was a reason to worry, my group would have more reason to worry than, say, Hispanics. But if you tell Hispanics, if we don't have enough, then you should panic, then that will be a signal from the government. And one of the weirder things in my book is that the head of NIH delayed the Moderna vaccine because they didn't have enough African Americans, and I think especially Hispanics. And he himself had written an article the year before in a medical journal saying we shouldn't use race in medicine. So we shouldn't use race in medicine, but we should delay a life-saving vaccine on racial grounds because there's not enough people of different races, even though there was literally no reason to believe that this would have any differential effects based on what your genetic background was, much less the crude racial categories. But I have to tell this anecdote because it relates to the Puerto Rican thing about the activists, because it's one of my favorite little anecdotes in the book with regard to Arab Americans in 2010 as part of the push to get a separate either Arab American or Middle Eastern North African classification. An Arab American group had a national campaign in places with large Arab populations that was called "Check It Right, You Ain't White." And the idea was to encourage Arab Americans to check the other classification so they could then go to the census officials and say, see, Arab Americans don't consider themselves to be white, so you need to have a separate classification. But actually, nevertheless, over 80% of Arab Americans, as far as the Census Bureau was concerned, ignored that and still checked the white box.
The story that you tell with respect to Puerto Ricans is it's a familiar one with other groups. So, I mean, Mexican Americans, the leading sort of self-defense organizations for Mexican Americans in the 1950s and early 1960s very strongly argued in favor of Mexican Americans viewing themselves as white. And in fact, in litigation, the anti-discrimination, when cases were brought with respect to discrimination against Mexican American kids in public schools, or discrimination with respect to jury selection, very often the argument was not that Mexican Americans are, that we're being treated wrongly because of their race, because they're, a different race. The argument was, we're white, and but we're not being treated as white. And indeed, you had some Mexican American leaders who, made a big show of distancing themselves from, Black civil rights groups. And now that changed. That changed in the late 60s, the early 70s. Mexican American groups actually thought, well, given various changes in American life, we'll do better not being white. We'll do better by championing brownness. And so, it's one of the things that's going on is, political calculation. And we see that political calculations change over time, along with other sorts of calculations. So as Professor Bernstein points out in his book, I mean, these classifications, it's not like they fall from the sky. They're created and they change. And I suppose, since they change, they are amenable to change. And one of the things that seems to me that you're getting at is you're prompting people to ask the question, how should we structure this? We shouldn't just accept what is. After all, we are the inheritors of a lot of bad stuff. We should be asking ourselves, what do we want? What would create a good society? And what are ways that are available to us to go about effectuating our vision of the good?
I want to ask you both about the term people of color, or BIPOC, actually, as it's sort of morphed into. I'm not really sure I completely understand the difference. Is the term people of color or BIPOC an attempt to cut out of racial classification either Asians or Hispanics who are not largely mestizo or Native American? Do you think that itself is a political calculus? Because what I think is so interesting is that you have, and you explain this in your book, Professor Bernstein, the census asks people, are you Hispanic? Yes or no. And then they ask you your race, and now you're allowed to pick more than one racial category. Many Hispanics do pick more than one racial category, but some Hispanics choose white, or they choose white and Native or Black. But is the term, so it's odd to me that somebody could be classified as both white Hispanic and as a person of color at the same time, right? Technically, that can happen with a Hispanic. And so was the term person of color sort of invented to declassify certain Hispanics, and more recently was the term BIPOC created to sort of declassify white adjacent, as some people say, Asians?
That's a good, I mean, I have to admit, I didn't really research the origins of people of color as such. My understanding has always been that people of color was an attempt to create a cross-ethnic minority coalition, so that, rather than just being African Americans as 12%, we could get 25-30% of the population, and that would be much more effective. And there was this sense that the Democratic Party's future, this was a big deal 20 years ago, lay in this coalition of people of color plus like well-educated college town and urban white people. And of course, one of the weird things about people of color is exactly what you say, is like, so I pointed out the book Linda Sarsour, who's not officially a member of a minority group according to the government, but she's Arab American. She is about, maybe a shade or two fairer skin than I am, but she says, well, I wear hijab, so that makes me a person of color. So there's a certain politicization of it that, phenotype isn't as important as something else. So I think people of color is meant to be ecumenical. I think BIPOC is meant to be less ecumenical. That I think that some activists in the African American community in particular were getting the sense that their concerns were being overridden by post-1965 immigrants, that many of the benefits of affirmative action, for example, like in contracting, are going to Hispanics and Asians and not to African Americans. And it's a way of, there's two different I've seen different versions of what BIPOC stands for, and they mean two different things. One would be Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which would include Asians and at least some Hispanics, but just sort of downgrade their status as, like, in the old days when Gilligan's Island first came on, they said, and the rest, for the last people who are like the co-stars, and eventually they added their names once the show got taken off. So it's like, and the rest. They're there, but they're not the stars of the show. The other possibility is Black, Indigenous, people of color, not no and that sort of excludes everybody else. Like maybe they're there somewhere, but they're not part of the main group. I think it's usually used in the former sense, but I also think it's intentionally ambiguous. It could be used in either way, depending on what the political situation merits. But I did want to use that to raise a point I mentioned in my talk, which is we have to all these one reason the classifications are a little bit screwy is they were all made in the 70s, and in the 70s we really still had primarily a black, white, biracial thing going on in the United States. Most of the population was white. Even Hispanics were generally classified as white, and then we had a black minority, and we had less than 1% Asian Americans. Now we decided that Hispanics are this quasi-racial group. They've grown to 20% of the population. Asian Americans have grown to 7%. We have a much larger cohort of people who are of a mixed race, and that's continuing to be growing. And the categories were frozen in that sort of situation, thinking that these are immutable classifications based on American history, but we've had an incredible sort of outbreak of diversity that wasn't anticipated at the time.
I like that outbreak of diversity. My understanding of people of color, there were two things that come to mind. I definitely, my perception fits with Professor Bernstein's. I thought that it was an attempt to create a big tent. Instead of being, 10%, you could, get 30% or something. And, it was a good political move. That was one thing going on. I think there is another thing going on, though I'm not sure. When I was, there was a time in American history when people referred to, especially Black people, as colored people. With somebody, see that colored man over there. And nowadays, that's very much frowned upon. Very much frowned upon. If you were to, refer to, President Obama as a colored man, I mean, people would, look at you and say, "Gosh, is this person been asleep for half a century or something?" I think people of color is okay as a way of describing somebody. Colored, on the other hand, I think in the view of many people is not okay. That's not my position, by the way. I mean, after all, there is an organization in the United States, a tremendous organization, one of the great organizations in the history of the United States, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's still its name. And so, I mean, frankly, I don't find anything wrong at all with referring to people as colored, but I think a lot of people do, though interestingly enough, people of color is okay. I think those, at least in my perception, it's those two things that are important in unpacking the term people of color.
Well, I think, all of this is interesting sort of from a sociological standpoint, how we identify, how individuals identify, and what groups they identify with, whether they see themselves just as part of a distinct nationality, Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, or part of a larger sort of pan-Latino community.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Asians. But it only really matters, and I think people only really get upset about it when you're talking about the implications for jobs, positions at schools, government contracts, right? And so I know you very studiously sort of tried to avoid wading into the affirmative action debate in your book because you wanted to establish the context and the background, but really that's the elephant in the room, right? And that it only matters whether or not a Chinese American counts as a minority or not when you're talking about the fact that perhaps maybe there are quotas on the number of Asians who can go to an elite university, right? Otherwise, that person doesn't care. That person thinks of themselves as Chinese American, celebrates their cultural holidays, may speak the language at home with their parents or not. But none of it really matters until you're talking about dispersing benefits. So really, that is the subtext for your book. How do you think the law should address that?
Well, I want to amend that a little bit. I mean, that is clearly important, but I actually don't think it's the only way it matters. It does matter. I mean, I think people, I mean, it's really weird, but it does, I think it sort of matters in how we get along with each other, whether it's for good or ill. I mean, there's the argument to be made. Another reason besides wanting to, well, Nixon added Cuban Americans because he wanted to reward them for voting Republican to the Hispanic classification. But he also, along with, the Chicano activists did not want a pan-Latino category because they thought we're Chicanos, we're, Mexican. But there were some activists who thought it would be good for political reasons to have, the Florida base with Cubans and New York and other places with Puerto Ricans. But Nixon wanted it because he said, these Chicano activists are causing trouble in California, and we have Puerto Rican terrorists who are nationalists, who are hijacking airplanes. Some of us are old enough to dimly remember this going on. And if we create a pan-Latino or pan-Spanish or whatever it is identity, it'll be an American identity. It'll make them more American. So we should just be aware that, these things, whether you like the identity or don't like it, I mean, I think we tend, to some extent, we accept these classifications as so natural. We're sort of like the fish who don't realize they're swimming in water because they don't know anything else. That we sort of talk about these groups as if they really are something more than a statistical construct, even when they're not. So that's one thing. I think it's also important, again, the medical research context is important. You're not really getting individualized benefits or harms generally from that, but it's affecting does affect medical treatment individually sometimes, but it affects that as well. With regard to Native Americans, there are laws that were passed to benefit Native Americans, like the Indian Child Welfare Act, and blanking on the name. There's the Rogers Act, or there's a Rogers case based on an act that requires that certain crimes for Indians have to be tried in federal court rather than state court. Both those laws were meant to help Native Americans. Actually being classified as Native American in those contexts tends to be harmful. So I think it does get somewhat more complicated. And I think also the distortion of social science research is a problem. So with all that said, at one point there are other issues out there besides.
Yes, no, of course, there are other issues, but to cite just one example, I don't think anybody really cared that Elizabeth Warren said she identified with her Cherokee heritage, except insofar as they thought maybe she might have gotten something that she didn't, quote unquote, deserve, right? I mean, do I care if Elizabeth Warren is, submitting recipes to a Cherokee cookbook and that, she's interested in her genealogy and connecting with her roots, if that's part of her family lore? No, I don't care about that. I do care about it insofar as, how did you use it in terms of applying for a job? And also, how do you, Elizabeth Warren, feel about affirmative action in terms of law school admissions at your own law school, right? So then it becomes relevant. Otherwise, it's not relevant to me other than as a curiosity.
Can I jump in on this?
Sure, go ahead.
First, I think that Professor Bernstein's book is very relevant to the ongoing struggle over affirmative action. One of the things that his book really does show, and it's come up in our conversation already, is the United States. I forget who it was amongst us who the eruption of diversity. I mean, it was one thing in the 1970s to talk about affirmative action when, overwhelmingly overwhelmingly, it was, black, white, maybe, Latino would figure in a little bit. But, the demographics of the country and the racial sensibility of the country has changed, I think, tremendously, so that people, and, and here I'm thinking especially of people who are proponents of affirmative action. It seems to me that the changing demographics of the country really do should prompt rethinking and rejiggering, and do we need to do something a bit different given the nature of the society. So I think in that way, the book is very pertinent to the ongoing affirmative action issue. Secondly, just a little footnote. In Professor Bernstein's book, he has a page or two about my colleague and my representative in the Senate, Elizabeth Warren, and I want to say, I think it's really the perception of her and her career as a legal academic. I think she was done a tremendous disservice. And here, I think that, and I feel that very strongly. I was on the faculty of Harvard Law School when when Harvard Law School made an offer to her. In fact, I was on the appointments committee, read all of her work, visited her contracts classes. I can say, and I have a very clear memory of this, there was absolutely no discussion. She did not trade on any claim of that, she was, a Native American. And in fact, that was not at all part of the discussion. If there had been even the littlest opening in that way, it would have, people would have seized it, because, and Ms. Braceras, you recall, because you were a student at Harvard Law School, you during a period, you were there during a period when the whole question of, a minority woman was a burning issue.
Right.
And, the powers that be would have loved to have, embraced any woman who could plausibly be viewed as, a minority woman. Elizabeth Warren came. That was not at all part of the discussion,
right? But
on
look,
her part or anybody else's part.
I just want to be clear. I had Elizabeth Warren as a student during that time before she was given, when she was there visiting. She was an amazing professor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't question her qualifications in any way, shape, or form. That's not why I raised it. I raised it only to say that that the question was only a question of public concern. The only reason it was relevant at all in the press was because of affirmative action generally. So the question of, did she put herself out there as this or not for purposes of employment? It wasn't relevant to the public in terms of anybody cared what her heritage was generally, right? So I'm not at all questioning her qualifications. I live in Massachusetts. I've never voted for her. I never will, but she was an amazing professor, and I don't question the tenure decision at all. I'm only saying that these things only become politically relevant to people when they think there are, jobs or certain things at stake, right?
Yeah.
So that's the only reason I raised. But I think we have to wrap up soon, but we have a question from Ilya Soman, who's been waiting very patiently for a long time, and I'd like to let Ilya have the floor.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So first, great job by both of you and excellent presentation. I wanted to ask sort of a brief question about something that's already come up both in the book and in discussion, which is the possibility of replacing at least many uses of racial classification with something like the ADOS classification, the American descendants of slaves. And I agreed, legally speaking, this might be less problematic and there might have some other advantages as well. But I would ask this question about it, that if it's really going to be a classification about people who are descendants of slaves, that may include many millions of people who we would normally think of as white, because there was a lot of interracial relations. Actually, Professor Kennedy has written about in his excellent book, Interracial Intimacies. If on the other hand, we say, no, it's only the Black descendants of slaves or the African-American descendants, whatever you want to call them, then we would have to find a way to determine who counts as an authentically or sufficiently authentically Black or African-American descendant of slaves. And we might be right back to the issue of racial classifications that we were trying to avoid by creating the ADOS category. And you would have issues with mixed race people, of course. You could say maybe it's not a racial thing, it's a cultural thing, but then you would have to ask, who is sufficiently culturally Black? Is Barack Obama sufficiently Black? Is Tiger Woods somebody else? So I wonder how you would handle that issue, and if, as Ms. Braceras says, jobs or university admissions or other things depend on this, then I can well imagine someone saying, like, I am 1/64th a descendant of a slave, or 1/16th or whatever. And of course, on the other side, we have the issues of, as Professor Kennedy said, a person who is considered Black, could that person necessarily prove that they're the descendant of a slave as opposed to a descendant of a free Black person, or some people like that, the descendant of an immigrant who came 100 years ago, and so on. So sort of that's the question. Thank you again.
Professor Bernstein, do you want to tackle that? Or Professor Kennedy?
Well, I mean, the word that jumped out in Professor Soman's remarks to me was the word authentic. And I think, again, it gets back to one of my real concerns. I asked earlier why is it that there haven't been, why hasn't there been more litigation? Why hasn't there been more fighting over questions of identification? And frankly, I think that, one reason is because I think there's a very widespread disinclination to police race, to tell you the truth. I mean, that's why I think, if you submit your papers, your admissions, your admissions packet or admissions folder, it's basically an honor system. And, there is no checking. In contrast, for instance, to Brazil, I mean, in Brazil, they have committees set up, and, you got to submit a photograph of yourself, and they take a look at people's photographs, and, they have people come, and, they really do a policing job on people. And in this country, there is a real resistance to that. And I'm glad there's a resistance to that. In fact, I've written before, as you know, I am a proponent of affirmative action. But frankly, if the price for affirmative action was a strong policing regime, I'd say forget it, because I would find that so obnoxious. I would find that so intrusive that it wouldn't be worth it, at least in my view. So, I think we need to be very careful about demanding, authenticity. Oftentimes, authenticity is viewed as a good thing, but the demand for authenticity, well, who, according to whom? What are we going to, what are you going to have to show in order to, to prove your authenticity? Last thing for me, again, I salute your book. It's not clear what the political upshot of your book is going to be. I think, frankly, that there'd be some people who would approach the book and knowing where you're coming from, knowing that you're sort of a, libertarian coded, I think many people would say a sort of a conservative libertarian. I think many people would come to your book with the hope that, well, I'm gonna read this book and it's going to be a book that's going to be hostile towards a strong anti-discrimination regime. It's going to be hostile towards affirmative action. Frankly, I think that people who come to your book with that expectation are going to be really quite disappointed. You do an analysis of racial classifications. You put, what the weaknesses are, you put what the strengths are. And it seems to me that the question of, well, where do we go with this is we have to have a separate conversation. It's not something that you really nail down. Now, some people might be disappointed with that. I'm not disappointed with it. It's, that's the next book. For what you dealt with, it seems to me that you very comprehensive, very, and again, I applaud.
Well, thank
Professor
you. I mean, this has been a great conversation. I accept all of your
Oh, I think he's frozen again.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know what's the connection there.
Okay.
Professor Bernstein, there you go.
Okay. If I freeze again, I'll just thank everybody and you can just sign off. But just to end it, I'm sorry I didn't answer Jennifer's question. But I mean, I was thinking affirmative action, we're going to be here another 3 hours if we start talking about the complications involved. I do think one little anecdote I have to mention just to show how things have evolved is that the first Supreme Court case involving affirmative action was the DeFunis case, which the court then decided not to rule on. But DeFunis himself, it turns out, was a Sephardic Jew. And actually, in the course of researching my book, I contacted his descendants and discovered that not only was he a Sephardic Jew, but his grandparents actually spoke Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish dialect at home. So he definitely could qualify as a Hispanic under current categories. But at the time, the classifications for affirmative action were either only African-American, Black, or sometimes I'm Mexican. Like in Bakke, it was Mexican, not Hispanic. So ironically, DeFunis would have been potentially on the other side of the litigation a decade or two later. I do think that there's, the one thing I will say is that I think that it is socially unacceptable, even to most conservatives, that if, say, Harvard Law School was only going to take people by LSAT and GPA. I haven't looked at more recent data, but the data was fairly grim as to how many African Americans would have been admitted solely on that, like 20 years ago when I was last really looking into this issue. It would be like 1% perhaps of the class. I just don't think that society would accept that, and thus you're going to have some accommodation for that, whether, for people, whether you're generally in favor of affirmative action or not. There could be a whole variety of ways one could do that. I will leave that much. I don't think that whatever happens with affirmative action in the Supreme Court, I don't think that concern and the social unacceptability of having a group of people who are seen as excluded from the mainstream America for generations not being represented at the highest levels of our educational system and so forth would be something that is viable for the at least in the near term, if ever. So there's that. And finally, I just want to say one thing, the last thing, I guess, about, yeah, I agree that in a way, I was sure there'd be more than one case involving racial, whether someone classified themselves properly. But you're right, there aren't as many as you think. I think it's partly what you said. We don't like to police it. The Solicitor General of Texas was asked in the Fisher litigation, does anyone ever check? And he says, no one checks, not at Texas, not at Harvard, nowhere in the country that we know of. And it does seem that people are generally fairly honest, except for some reason with the American Indian classification. That is where I have some data in my book about law schools. The Department of Transportation actually changed its criteria a couple of years ago, and they required membership because they found there was so much for why people are willing to say they're American Indian, but not Black or Latino. I don't know, but they are. One reason that you don't police it also is that in some ways you can't. So my daughter is a high school senior, so I was very curious to see what the Common App that's used says about this. And they ask you what group you belong to. But oddly enough, as with most of these forms, they don't actually tell you what it means to be a member of the group. There are official definitions, but you're not actually given them. I keep hearing these stories, which may be apocryphal. I couldn't really document any of them except for one, where someone claims to be African American, but they're from Morocco or Egypt, or they're a white South African. But if such stories exist, I'm not sure you can even prosecute or expel someone for one, because all it says is, which of these do you identify with? Then it says Black/African American. And it'd be pretty hard to prove mens rea here, because without the actual definition, descended from one of the Black races of Africa, I can imagine an honest immigrant from South Africa saying, well, I'm from Africa and I'm American, and not recognizing it. So how would you prove that they were trying to defraud anybody?
There have been actual at Georgetown.
That's the one.
About 15 years ago, there was a white guy, and from what I gather, he wasn't trying to be facetious. He wasn't trying to game anything. He was just sort of filling out the forms and just sort of being literal minded. And he put African American, and and then when this sort of was revealed, people really went after him because they thought that he was trying to pull a fast one. But from what I gather, he really wasn't. I mean, it is an interesting, little episode. It does show the problems of, I guess, textualism and being literal minded, and also shows how these categories, again, on the edges. Again, my sense was this guy wasn't trying to pull a fast one, but on the edges, you are going to have, funny things happen. You are going to have noisiness, and it seems to me that that's, virtually, unavoidable.
Well, thank you both. This has been such an interesting conversation. And frankly, I could probably keep talking to you both for another hour, but I think our audience wants to go to bed. So on that note, I'm going to kick it back to Olivia for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I just wanted to thank both of our speakers today, Professor Bernstein and Professor Kennedy. Really appreciate your time, as well as our referee, Jennifer, for your time, all of your insights. And thank you to all of our attendees tonight as well. Thanks for coming, and hope you have a great night.
Thank you.
you.